Well, welcome viewers, Dr. JWAU. On the subject, who is ruling Australia? It's a behavioural political analysis, hopefully more of a therapy journey for people that are pretty well traumatised by the establishment and its management of the country and its ripple effect on us. This is episode 38, when Australians started recognising and realising fragmentation had become an establishment strategy. Well, in episode 37, Australians returning toward the Christian constitution, they turned back to the Christian constitutional foundations modern systems proved incapable of replacing so far. And this episode escalates the constitutional theological exposure further. Fragmentation itself increasingly functioning as an establishment mechanism for weakening Christian constitutional conscience and expanding institutional authority. Now, if you don't mind, I'm going to read that again because this is critical. You have to, if you really want to repair from your mental abuse that you're receiving from the establishment, listen. I'm going to escalate the constitutional theological exposure further. Fragmentation, community fragmentation itself, increasingly functioning as an establishment mechanism for weakening Christian constitutional consciousness and expanding institutional authority. I'll say that in one word: immigration. At first, the fragmentation still appeared accidental. More cultural complexity, more demographic expansion, more competing moral systems, more administrative diversity frameworks, presented as inevitable features of modern civilization. Australians were told national coherence itself had become outdated. Then slowly another recognition began surfacing beneath the constitutional exhaustion. Well, let's just say the establishment exhaustion. Fragmentation was not merely being managed, it was increasingly being utilised. Yes, that is a cat. It's a real cat. Okay, just making sure, Fluffy. Inheritance once depended upon population, the Australian population, retaining enough shared moral architecture to, number one, recognise limits upon power, the establishment's power, preserve conscience protections, tickle versus giggle, restrain government internally, that means keep it morally aware, and maintain civilization continuity beneath divine authority higher than the institution itself. That's Christianity, basically the Christian God over the establishments. But once establishments served themselves or severed themselves from divine sovereign restraint, a different administrative logic slowly emerged. Shared constitutional consciousness weakened. Christian moral coherence diluted. Foundational memory blurred. National identity fragmented into administratively managed populations. increasingly disconnected from the inheritance that once restrained institutional expansion naturally. Basically, what I'm trying to say is, in simple language, immigration's a way of diluting consciousness toward Christian constitutional protections from the establishment. The paradox deepens further. Institutions continue speaking the language of inclusion while progressively dissolving the civilization cohesion required for constitutional continuity itself. Not because diversity alone destroys nations, but because establishments detached from transcendent moral foundations increasingly governed through fragmentation, management, rather than shared moral restraint. And I'm going to say that again because this is deep. Diversity alone does not destroy nations. But because establishments detach from divine moral foundations, in divine moral Australian foundations, increasingly govern through fragmentation management rather than shared moral restraint. So while they're trying to keep the blur over the Christian constitutional rights that the Australians have, they're micro-incrementally dissolving even further these values by justifying other religions above Christianity. And that changes the atmosphere underneath Australia profoundly. The citizen no longer primarily experiences shared constitutional inheritance, common moral reference, covenant continuity, or spiritually grounded national coherence. Instead, the population increasingly experiences competitive narratives. Now, tell me if you can relate to this. Competitive narratives, identity fragmentation, administratively mediated coexistence, behavioural management structures, and expanding institutional arbitration, replacing shared civilization assumptions. And this is where the establishment strategy underlay intensifies. Because a population disconnected from Christian constitutional memory, because a population disconnected from Christian constitutional memory, divine restraint over establishment, moral continuity in the establishment, and shared civilizational foundations between the establishment and the people, becomes progressively easier to administratively manage, psychologically fragment, behaviourally supervise, Tiggle versus giggle, comply or be punished, emotionally regulate, that's fear, and constitutionally distance from protections, that's the Constitution, originally designed to restrain institutional power itself. The issue is not authenticity. It's not the authenticity. The issue is institutions increasingly replacing shared divine constitutional identity with permanently managed fragmentation beneath expanding administrative authority. That's immigration. They're using immigration to fragment the population away from Christian protections. You see, Christianity protects the nation, but people aren't saying this. Tommy Robinson has come out with it. The inversion becomes existential over time, because once Christian constitutional consciousness fades deeply enough, which is what they're trying to do, citizens eventually stop recognising what government was forbidden to become, what conscience was designed to protect, why power, the establishment, requires restraint, and why divine sovereign authority stood above the state originally. Now, I hope you're starting to see where we are in Australia. And it's not good. And I don't think it's going to stop. The country still functions procedurally, but spiritually and constitutionally, the continuity underneath grows thinner. And somewhere beneath the fragmentation, another truth slowly begins surfacing. A civilization becomes progressively governable once establishments sever the population from the Christian constitutional inheritance that once unified moral restraint, limited power, protected conscience, and prevented institutions from becoming the highest authority within society itself. And I ask anybody to try and explain it better than that. I'm Dr. JWA, theologist, Central Coast, New South Wales, Australia. Like, subscribe, comment to educate me, share to help somebody else. I'll see you in the next talk.